Welcome back to Throwback Thursday. We hope you enjoyed our first video, and thank you so much for joining us again. In this new NC Learn at Home video, we're going to take a look at more of what you'll find on the first floor of the North Carolina State Capitol. One of the most noteworthy features in our rotunda, the thing that people tend to notice right when they walk into this round space in the center of the Capitol building, is this grand statue of George Washington, right? So the first reaction that people have when they see this statue of George Washington is, that's not George Washington. And the second reaction is usually, that looks nothing like George Washington, right? When they're finally convinced that this is indeed a portrayal of George Washington. This is a really unusual way to see Washington. Usually when we see him or when we picture him in our heads, he's depicted in either a military uniform or he's depicted in his planter's clothes, right? So those are the two really traditional portrayals of Washington. And here, Washington is depicted as a Roman. And the reason that we have this really unique portrayal of George Washington is that the state of North Carolina wanted a grand statue to honor Washington following the War of 1812, right? Washington had died at that point. He died in 1799. And so the state devoted this huge chunk of money to commissioning this piece of public art to honor Washington. And so they asked for recommendations on who could sculpt this grand statue from another of America's early presidents, Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson recommended a sculptor named Antonio Canova. And Canova was an Italian sculptor, and Jefferson, in letters, referred to Canova as the first sculptor in the world. So he meant that Canova was the best sculptor, right? So Canova lived in Italy, and he was very busy with other commissions of European monarchs, of other European leaders. But he accepted this commission to do a statue of George Washington because he admired the legacy of George Washington. And this was actually the only commission that Canova ever accepted for an American. So Canova sets to make this grand statue of Washington, and he has never met George Washington, and he also has, of course, no photographs of Washington to work from. So he's given a bust of George Washington. And he's also given Thomas Jefferson's recommendations that Canova should sculpt Washington as a Roman, because Jefferson said that our American regimentals had a very puny effect, right? So Canova works on this commission, he completes it, and it's sent to North Carolina from Italy. And when it arrives here, it was installed in the first State House here on Union Square on Christmas Eve of 1821. And it was quite controversial to Raleigh citizens when it was unveiled because it is such an unusual portrayal of our first president, right? So the General Assembly actually even had to make it illegal to spit upon this statue, because apparently that's how people were expressing their distaste with this portrayal. So here in the statue, Washington is actually depicted seated, right? So in most of the traditional portrayals of George Washington, you see him depicted standing, usually with his arms outstretched, right? Washington was meant to depict, he was meant to be the consummate statesman in depictions, right? So he has his arms outstretched to the people. So here he's seated like a monarch on a throne. He's also using a Roman stylus to write. And the first words on his tablet there are Giorgio Washington. So Giorgio is actually George in Italian, right? The words below his name there are the first few words of his presidential address, but they're written in Italian. Here he's also depicted with a very short, close-cropped Caesar haircut, right? So that was a very Roman, traditionally Roman haircut. And basically the entirety of his bare leg is visible here as well. So you see his knees, uncovered knees, and you even see his toes there in his Roman sandals. So this was a very unusual and very controversial portrayal of George Washington. So it was installed here in that first state house that stood on Union Square. But then, of course, that state house burned down in 1831. And the original statue that had only been here in North Carolina for about 10 years was crushed as the building collapsed, right? Pretty much right from the time of that state house fire, bits and pieces of the original Washington statue were lost as people took souvenirs from that state house fire. So this is actually a copy of the original statue. It was placed here in our rotunda in 1970, and it actually was created using the original models from Canova's workshop in Italy. It was sculpted by another Italian sculptor named Romano Vio. Thanks again for joining us for another episode of Learn at Home with NC Historic Sites. We look forward to having you back at the Capitol again soon. You can always learn more about the Capitol by visiting our website at historicsites.nc.gov/Capitol or at NC State Capitol on all social media platforms.